Ladies and gentlemen, our first panel, the inaugural panel of the Raisina Dialogue 2017, is Big Power Politics and New Challenges, which is, in this week of great change and disruption across the world, extremely salient and relevant. Our four speakers are Mr. Prakash, Sharan, Mahat, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nepal; Mr. Hamid Karzai, former President of Afghanistan; Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia; and Mr. M.J. Akbar, Minister of State for External Affairs, Government of India. Could I invite our four speakers to please come on to the stage? If my colleagues from ORF could escort them, please. President Karzai has just joined us. Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next hour and 10 minutes, we'll have keynote addresses from each of our four distinguished panelists. If you do have time after that, we could ask a couple of questions. Could I start with asking Minister for Foreign Affairs, Government of Nepal, Mr. Prakash Sharan Mahat, to make the opening remarks. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Whatever.
Excellency M.J. Akbar, Minister of State for External Affairs, Excellency Hamid Karzai, former President of Afghanistan, Excellency Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great honor to be invited to speak before the distinguished participant of Raisina Dialogue. I congratulate Minister of External Affairs of India and Observer Research Foundation for successfully steering India's flagship conference on issues of global importance. I am confident that the deliberation during this dialogue would be helpful in generating new insights on how we can act as regional and global community to overcome the persistent as well as emerging challenges we face and navigate towards greater peace, security, development, and prosperity. We appreciate India's commitment to contribute to this end through the annual holding of this dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, although we have achieved a remarkable success in global economic growth, technological advancement, and unprecedented level of globalization, we are witnessing unexpected political development, tragic humanitarian crisis in several zones of conflicts, and brutal terror attacks around the world. New fault lines are emerging. Uncertainties are visible. Cradle of liberal old order and openness is yielding to the appeals of closed nationalism. Places that led the idea of free flow of goods and services are now talking about barriers and restrictions. We live today amid perplexing contradictions. None of us deny that the enormous challenges humanity confronts today do not have a unilateral solution. Solutions are multilateral, yet these institutions suffer more than ever today from our own skepticism and lack of accommodative spirit. Reform of these institutions so as to make them inclusive and reflective of changing realities has remained elusive. In 2015, we demonstrated our collective ability to address global challenges by adopting SDGs and Paris Agreement. Nevertheless, agreement on several critical agendas of multilateral process have been hard to reach. Implementation of agreed agenda is another big challenge. We have seen significant evolution of regional institutions in scope as well as substance. New regional and sub-regional groupings are gaining footing in global politics. Yet in many regions, process of regional integration is marching backward. In terms of knowledge, technology, trade, and investment, the world is more integrated than ever. Thanks to the technological innovation, physical distance has evaporated. But backlashes against globalization are building up. Political developments are apparently moving in a reverse gear. Rhetorics of barriers rather than bridges is getting popular. Years ago, the world celebrated the end of Cold War and was prompted to nurture hope that big power rivalry would reduce the costly militarization. 2.5 decades later, the world's military expenditure is historic high and many times higher than what we collectively spend in people's health and education. We saw the ideological rivalry was fading and rule of law and democracy were gaining ground. 25 years later, democratic institutions and polity have made tremendous strides, but it still faces challenges of enormous scale. New forces of division in the form of sectarian violence, religious extremism, and terrorism are gaining ground, posing great threat to individual liberty, democratic institutions, and rule of law. Never in history had our world been so affluent. Yet the gap between rich and poor is big and alarmingly visible. Contradictions like this led to a host of colossal challenges which we face today and which we must find ways to address. Though absolute number of poor has declined drastically, poverty, hunger, and underdevelopment are the world's major challenges today as they were before. 1/4 of the members of international community are still the least developed countries struggling to provide a minimum decent living to their people. Despite decades of efforts, their quest for developmental transformation has received setbacks. They are constrained by lack of resources. International support measures have not been either effective or adequate. In the highly interconnected world, these countries tend to bear the most painful brunt of global crisis and market fluctuation of every kind. Most of these countries struggle to achieve MDGs and are now facing an uphill task to pursue sustainable development goals. They face the threat of shrinking developmental assistance, and such assistance is increasingly diverted away from much-needed critical infrastructure and productive sector. Trade preferences aim to enhance these countries' export share increasingly faces preference erosion. Threat of climate change has become more pronounced than ever. When it comes to vagaries of Mother Nature, the poor are the most to suffer as they lack capacity to adapt. A low industrialized country like Nepal emits insignificantly low amount of greenhouse gases and has no contribution to global warming, but impact of global warming is already visible in terms of erratic climate conditions and melting of glaciers and ices in Himalayan region, which would not only trigger problem in Nepal, but also pose a threat of water crisis in South Asian region. Those who have resources and technology are preoccupied with maintaining momentum of growth and affluence, while countries on the other side of developmental spectrum are distressed by how their people survive amid drying farmland and diminishing water resources. We are therefore concerned about how effectively the Paris Agreement will be implemented, particularly by big actors, and whether this will be sufficient to curb global warming within the scientifically prescribed limit. Terrorism continue to remain the alarming threat to peace and stability at the global as well as at our own region. Resolute international and regional actions, including binding legal instruments, are essential to fight this menace. In our pursuit to defeat terrorism, we should not limit ourselves in words. Our actions should be resolute. Migration has become an inevitable phenomenon of the contemporary world. Movement of people has brought both benefit and challenges. Their contribution to both the development and growth of host economy as well as countries of origin are immense. Welfare and protection of the rights and well-being of migrant workers must be our common priority. As we strive for rapid socio-economic development, effort to attain the universal and transformative 2030 agenda for sustainable development remain paramount. In this regard, sound development policies and frameworks backed by proper institutional mechanism, adequate resources, and innovative method of implementation are essential, along with robust international partnership and fulfillment of agreed commitments. Energy security is an important component of sustainable development and economic security. Energy cooperation should be directed towards ensuring energy security for all. In this context, development of hydropower in Nepal is the area that promises great opportunities for partnership. we have not able to fully exploit its huge water resources potential despite the persistent need of clean energy in our region. Investment and technology, enhanced interconnectivity and access to power market are essential to harness the full potential. I am happy to state that Nepal and India are working towards open market access in power trade at bilateral and sub-regional level. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that greater regional integration is beneficial to all, and guided by this conviction, Nepal has actively contributed to the regional process of SAARC and BIMSTEC. However, evolution of SAARC process has been painfully slow to achieve regional integration, and we must address the root causes to materialize the noble vision of regional prosperity and integration. We are also working actively in sub-regional framework of BBIN to achieve greater cross-border connectivity and cooperation in vital sector of trade, transit, and energy. Closer to our neighborhood, Nepal and India have been consolidating a deeper partnership for growth and prosperity. Our challenges are common, and successful practices on one side of the border are indeed worth emulating on the other side as well. We are inspired by the phenomenal progress India is making in all fronts, ranging from economic growth, science and technology, and rule of law to consolidation of democracy. How we can rise as a close neighbor with India's rise is our key interest. We are impressed by some of the bold initiatives India has taken under Prime Minister Modi's leadership to ensure digital and financial access to the poor and fight against corruption. Nepal is also working towards these goals. Prime Minister Modi sparked great optimism when he articulated the vision of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas and neighborhood first policy. We like to see greater translation of this vision into concrete deliverables, be it in the form of more trade, investment, and connectivity in the form of railways, highways, and transmission infrastructures, and mega projects as joint undertakings. On socio-political context at home, I am pleased to share with this August gathering that Nepal has achieved transformation of historic proportion in the past 10 years. Transition has been lengthy, costly, and at times full of uncertainties. But our leadership has been able to manage the complicated process with due diligence. Decade-long armed conflict gave way to peaceful political process, and just last year, the historical promulgation of the Constitution marked the realization of long-held dream of Nepali people for inclusive and democratic polity. We are thankful to India's continued support in our quest for peace and democracy. The Constitution now provides a right-based and forward-looking foundation of country's governance and a framework to accommodate the socially, culturally, and geographically diverse Nepali society. Our efforts are ongoing to accommodate everyone within the constitutional framework by addressing their legitimate concerns, and we are confident that we will succeed. As a major step in the implementation of the Constitution, we will hold election at local, provincial, and national level within a year. We want to utilize our full potential. The goodwill, solidarity, and support from our neighbors and international community will be important as we move towards effective implementation of the Constitution and undertaking of the vital task of socio-economic transformation of Nepal. Despite having suffered from decade-long conflict and then long political transition, Nepal has made significant progress in social development. We want to build on that. Needless to say, the peaceful, prosperous, and developed Nepal can be an instrumental force for peace and security and catalyst for a more constructive partnership in the region and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that today's problem can be resolved by harmonizing national, institutional, communal, and individual interests with regional and global development. For this, we need to build new highways of hopes and healings connecting all states and peoples. We need to emerge out of our cynical as well as complacency. We need to build bridges rather than barriers. We need to act in synergy rather than silos. We need to embrace connectivity rather than cynical cocoons. We need to embrace rule of law and shun violence as means to bring changes. As we face unprecedented challenge to tackle the problem of global scale, we do have enormous opportunities too. Such opportunity exists in the form of growing technological prowess, increasing physical connectivity, larger educated mass worldwide, greater degree of cultural interface, and many more. The dexterity and innovativeness of youth is the key for our future. It is the key to build resilience, address challenges, and to provide practical remedies to the maladies of all. We must engage the large population of youth in mainstream of big politics. To nurture their creativity, we must educate their curiosity. To channel their energy, we must fill them with positive purpose. We should build on this asset to transform the world into a better place to live in for ourselves as well as the generation to come, for people living in affluence as well as those in abjection, for countries in the upper rung of developmental spectrum as well as those in the tail end. To change, society must create the environment for the intelligent and diligent to prosper and excel, but protect the weaker and vulnerable. Only then island of prosperity expand to include oceans of denial and deprivation. Only winners take all mindset may make everyone loser. A great Indian soul, Swami Vivekananda, said long ago, we are what our thoughts make us. Indeed, this is the moment for making hard choices. If we comprehend the complexity of the present and prepare for the new age together, nothing less than a robust and transformative political, economic, social and national security and foreign policy architecture will give outlet from the problems we face. Leadership of wisdom and courage, ethics and morality can create a new collective consciousness, bringing everyone together in the culture of peace and tolerance, coexistence and cooperation, as best represented by Buddha and Gandhi. Inspired by them, can our dialogue reflect on a new politics of liberty, law and security, economics of free enterprises with equity, society of social justice, caring and sharing, culture of reward for good work and punishment for bad, and policy of friendship with all and hostility with none, as the foundation of this new global architecture for the 21st century. As responsible government and leaders of society and businesses, we should ensure fulfillment of people's desire and their prosperity and freedom. We have the capacity, means, and resources to address the challenges and ensure prosperity. What we need is the willpower to achieve this, and as we do so, we must be reminded to carry along the countries and society that are languishing at the bottom of the development ladder. I wish for the success of the second edition of Raisina Dialogue. Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, honorable panelists, Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister of Australia, Foreign Minister of Nepal, ladies and gentlemen, and to my Indian friends and audience, ये मुलाकात एक बहाना है, प्यार का सिलसिला पुराना है. It's not my first time. I've been here before. Well, the theme of the second Raisina conference, which I had the honor of attending last year too, this year is of immense significance. Noting the changing world and the emergence of new powers, new superpowers. And as the Prime Minister of India, Honorable Modi just said earlier, this is the century of Asia. For we have in Asia two new superpowers emerging, China and India, and also the re-emergence of an old superpower, Russia. the new normal, multilateralism, multipolarity. Well, I come from a country that is too poor, too small, but somehow for centuries it has been engaged with all these big powers. We don't know why we attract them all. From Great Britain to the Tsarist Russia, then to the Soviet Union, the United States, and of course, you remember the past 40 years, to 2002, where Afghanistan once again was the center of world's attention. Now here's what differentiates 19th century and 20th century from the 21st century multipolarity and the emergence of rivalries and or cooperation. We have the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Rudd here with us, who is very familiar with Afghanistan, who served his country while his country's troops were serving in Afghanistan. We have the Minister of State of India, Mr. M.J. Akbar, whose country, India, our good friend, has been at the forefront of assistance to Afghanistan, and we are very, very grateful in providing all that we need in the whole spectrum of assistance, from education to dams to electricity. Prime Minister Modi refers to that in very eloquent words. And as I began, we attract these big powers. And in 2002, we attracted these big powers for a cause that we all embraced. The cause of freedom for Afghanistan and the cause of peace for the world and stability for the world away from terrorism and extremism and radicalism that hurt us all the way to the Twin Towers in America and the loss of life elsewhere. I witnessed that. I happened to become the president of the country at that time for another 13 years. And I witnessed how multipolarity worked in Afghanistan and how multilateral interaction took between competing interests in Afghanistan. And as you all remember, ladies and gentlemen, when we began, Afghanistan had nothing. It was a debilitated, destroyed state. Nothing there that you could call in the form of a government or functions of a state. The world, the West, led by the United States, and the rest of the world, major powers, all joined hands. In the initial days of my government, I didn't have the means to travel abroad. So the US would take the Afghan president on their Air Force planes, Air Force Two in my case. The Russians would send their government plane to take me to Moscow. Competing powers, Russia and America. Very competing powers. China would fly me from Japan to Beijing and from Beijing to Tajikistan. Saudi Arabia would send their own special plane, in Iran the same way. And we saw a wonderful example of multipolarity at work, at multilateral dimensions of cooperation. The Indians gave us thousands of scholarships. The Americans built us roads. The Russians supplied us helicopters. The Chinese helped us in recreating our canal systems. Japan gave us billions of dollars and hosted the first conference in Tokyo. Iran was supportive of the US action in Afghanistan. The US accepted Iran's interests in Afghanistan. The Saudis built part of the roads that the Americans were building for us. And Pakistan, too, wanted to contribute in spite of India's presence there. Now, this is what we desire for the whole of the world. And this is what we had in Afghanistan from 2002 till very recently. Do we have the same today in Afghanistan? Unfortunately, no. Is it disappearing? Yes, it is. I remember 2009, 10, 11, 12, as we were negotiating with the United States our bilateral security agreement. Once I complained to President Putin, whom I highly admire for bringing Russia back to the world stage in a significant way. American friends shouldn't mind me saying this. I told President Putin that I had worries about Afghanistan, that the way the United States and our Western allies are conducting the war on terror is not leading us to less extremism in our region or in Afghanistan, that we see rising extremism in spite of this massive sacrifice of life and resources by our friends, including Australia and Canada, Prime Minister Harper sitting there, and by our other allies, and also the Afghan people. And you know what President Putin told me? He said, President Karzai, this is 2008, 9, 10. I mean, I've been repeating my message repeatedly during those years. He told me, President Karzai, we and the United States have differences of views on things in many parts of the world. But in Afghanistan, we see eye to eye, and we are helping them. So we have allowed NATO to transport their goods through Russian territory to Afghanistan. And as we were preparing for the Afghan Loya to discuss whether we should sign the bilateral security agreement with America or not, I happened to twice or thrice visit Beijing, both during the office of President Hu Jintao and also during the office of the current President Xi Jinping. And discussing the Afghan-American arrangement, China did not oppose it, ladies and gentlemen. The Chinese said, well, if it suits your security and if it's bringing you security, we are for it. Go ahead and sign it. I would show hesitation. They would show support against my hesitation. India, of course, encouraged me, both the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and the current Prime Minister Modi, to sign the bilateral security agreement with America. The Saudis the same way. So we saw this massive cooperation of a multipolar world with varying interests in multilateral forms in Afghanistan, which I, at that time, in my early days of government, called the cooperation of civilizations. We had a Muslim country joining hand with the Buddhist country, Japan, to build segments of highways in Afghanistan. We had the Christian world and the Muslim world joining hands to build other parts of Afghanistan. We had a Hindu state mainly, and Muslims and Christians and others joining hands in China, helping us to build Afghanistan. It sounds almost wishful, as I can see you're looking at me like that. Well, what's he talking about? That was true. It happened. Why don't we have it today? Look at Syria. Look at Iraq. Look at the differences. Look where Turkey has gone away from the traditional allies. Look at the concerns of Russia. Look at the concerns of China. Look at the concerns of India. Earlier, the Prime Minister spoke about extremism, terrorism, and the use of it, and the dangers it poses to us all. The prolongation of the so-called war against terror, not showing results, having more negative consequences. So when we work for a cause, and the time frame is long and not limited to datelines, we come to where we are today. My hope is, ladies and gentlemen, that the new normal will not be a conflictful multilateral world, but that the new normal will be a cooperative multilateral world, as we saw in Afghanistan from 2002 till very recently. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister Harper, President Karzai, distinguished colleagues, distinguished friends, friends of India, that which unites us all here in this room this evening. Thank you for the kind invitation to address this Raisina Dialogue put together by the Ministry of External Affairs, the Observer Research Foundation, and for the privilege of being able to address you this evening. And it's also been a privilege to listen to the address of Prime Minister Modi. Far-ranging, wide-sweeping, covering the regions, covering the globe, and India's role in it. I said to him as he left the room, I like particularly his comments about India's mindset and how that is engineered for the future. So to you, my friends, a Minister of State, I only have one complaint, and that is you've, for me, interrupted a perfectly good summer of Australian Test cricket. So I have just one request for the next such dialogue, if you could coordinate with the Australian Cricket Board. We've just been through a summer where we thrashed Pakistan 3-0 by an innings in the second test to the Sydney Cricket Ground. So next time round, let's just get our diaries together. It's good to be back in Delhi. I've been here many times over the years as a diplomat, as a foreign minister, as a member of parliament, as a prime minister, and now as a global citizen of no fixed abode. I head an American think tank in New York. It's been a privilege to work with Indian leaders in the G20 and the East Asia Summit, the United Nations, and other institutions. And it's been a privilege to look firsthand at the dynamism of the evolution of not just the wonderfully robust Indian democracy that you celebrate every day, but the new dynamism of the economy, as well as the new dynamism of your own place in the region and the world, and what I also see in your civil society. And speaking of civil society, I'm honoured on this occasion to have become the global patron of one of your own Indian homegrown NGOs, Barefoot Doctors, established by Bunker Roy 45 years ago, delivering very basic programs, including solar energy, locally sustained by local people in the most remote villages of the world. And they do great work. And all these things speak well of India. Your economy has been the only bright spot in the last several years in what has been a global economy. And for this, India should be congratulated. Indeed, the reform and sustainable growth of this economy for the future is not just of critical and core importance for yourselves, it's of core importance for the rest of us around the world at large. And so all of us, I think, who are from around the world attending this conference, resident in Delhi or those who are visiting for it, genuinely, people of goodwill wish the Indian government well on the important global task in which you're engaged. It's no small thing turning around a democracy of 1.3 billion people. It was hard enough for me with 25 million. Why is it that we feel uncertain today? The topic I've been asked to address, and we're asked to address in this session, is what are the big politics and new challenges for the year ahead? And if you travel the world, and what you pick up in every capital in these troubled times in which we live is a pervasive feeling of uncertainty. But this is not just a subjective feeling. There's a thing called the Global Uncertainty Index. It now runs at the highest level it's been since the beginning of this millennium. And this is not just an idle phenomenon. They track the aggregation of political and economic and environmental risks, and they produce this data. And when uncertainty is high, what we do know for a fact is that it affects whether individuals consume and how much they consume and how much they save. It affects radically the decisions of firms and whether they invest or put it up for another day. And we see that across the world at present, where we have something akin to a global private investment strike. And thirdly, uncertainty affects the national policy decisions of governments around the world as well. We live indeed in these uncertain times. So in my allocated time, given the task, which is what actually is driving the uncertainty, what is the big politics of our time, and what are the big challenges which are emerging for this year, 2017, let me try and list quickly 5 to 10 of them. I call it 2017 the year of living dangerously. Challenge number 1, the future policy direction of the Trump administration. It's the elephant in everybody's living room in every continent as we speak. The truth is, none of us know. Very few of us have any insight into what will be the policy detail of this administration. That of itself contributes, by the way, to the uncertainty index. But we can, I believe, begin to discern President Trump's core convictions from what he's been saying consistently, not just during the election campaign, but most critically, consistently since the campaign. Number 1, I believe that what we can profitably describe President Trump as is not an American populist. I don't think that adds to our analysis. I think he is an American nationalist, an old-fashioned American nationalist of a type we have not seen for many decades. Number 2, his presidency, I believe, will be an overwhelming domestic presidency. He has a core economic agenda. The constituency which elected him are concerned about their economic security. It is the domain in which he is most comfortable, coming from the domain of business. And therefore, as we seek to understand the impact of a Trump presidency on the world, we should understand first and foremost that it will be seen through the prism of American national economic interests. Number 3, President Trump has a profoundly negative predisposition against China. Number 4, he has an entrenched predisposition to do whatever he can to normalize relations with Russia. Number 5, he's likely to be a capital P protectionist. And while this may create tensions within the American Congress, it will create much less tensions among the American people. Number 6, he has a deep view that America's central national security challenge is global Islamic terrorism. And finally, he is deeply sceptical about the compatibility of a global rules-based order with his deeply nationalist agenda. And his recent excoriation of the United Nations is likely to be just one of many shots he fires across the bows of the multilateral system, be it the UN or beyond. Challenge number 2, will US-Russia rapprochement work? Hardheads, both in Moscow and Washington, and I've just come from the Gaidar Forum in Moscow, have some doubts about this. But the new president has made a simple conclusion which we should all pay very close attention to, and that is he does not see Russia as representing a long-term threat to making America great again as the only uncontested superpower in the world. However, he has made a conclusion that China does constitute such a threat to American long-term interests. The question is whether intelligence scandals in the United States involving Russia in recent times will cause the Trump administration to begin correcting against the now widely expected normalization process with Moscow. If normalization does proceed, we should look carefully at the nature of the deal which Mr. Trump has begun to outline in terms of sanctions removal on the one hand, in exchange for an ill-defined new nuclear agreement with Russia on the other, in addition to what becomes possible in ending the war in Syria and wider cooperation in what he describes as the global war against Islamic terrorism. Challenge number 3, the future of the US-China relationship. In the months since the presidential election, President Trump has engaged in a brutal public exchange with China on 5 core issues: the One China policy, the South China Sea, North Korea, Chinese cyber attacks, and China's trade and currency manipulation, quote-unquote, practices. These comments have not been confined to the election process or the campaign process itself. Most critically, they have continued since then and, in fact, have escalated since then. Although how far Mr. Trump and his administration will push each of these in office remains to be seen. The problem is that if political thresholds are crossed on the one China policy, as opposed to the other problematic areas of the relationship, we may find ourselves in deep water sooner than any of us think. As this audience in particular well knows, the one China policy is of fundamental ideology and identity significance for the Chinese Communist Party. But President Trump, by contrast, sees it, yes, as another negotiating chip in bargaining a better deal with the People's Republic of China. For that reason, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of the new administration, once inauguration is behind them, having US carrier deployments in the Taiwan Strait in response to the Chinese deployment there last week. As a student of escalation politics and international relations, I'm concerned about the ability of the diplomatic machinery between the two countries to manage any such escalation, given the overwhelming nationalist sentiment that may overtake the rational processes of normal relationship management. More broadly, President Trump, who has a keen ear for reading his country's domestic politics, as demonstrated by an unanticipated electoral victory, he may in fact be riding the crest of a wave of growing long-term anti-Chinese sentiment across all elements, or most elements, of American politics, society and the economy, which have been building up over a long period of time. A sentiment lying well outside the foreign policy elites historically entrusted with the management of the US-China relationship. Challenge number 4, the future of the strategic triangle between Washington, Moscow and Beijing. It's unique, as an Indian colleague reminded me yesterday, that a president-elect of the United States of America has been voted into office on the basis of normalizing relations with Russia and identifying Russia as a potential long-term strategic partner. This turns absolutely on its head US presidential, foreign and national security policy orthodoxies that have existed more or less since 1945. This is unique. Equally, President Trump is proving to be unique in the case of China. For the first time since 1972, the cornerstone of the US-China relationship, the one China policy, has been thrown up into the air, rather than being taken as a given in the relationship. These two sets of policy departures, one on Russia, the other on China, are of genuine historic significance, if they are delivered into reality. The open question for the year ahead is whether we'll see concrete signs of this radical change in language leading to a radical retriangulation of the strategic framework laid out in 1972 between Nixon and Mao. That is, a US-China strategic accommodation against a common ideological, political and military foe, the then Soviet Union. In understanding this, we should note that there have been a number of growing tensions, perhaps beneath the surface, in the China-Russia relationship, based on a Russian sense of strategic vulnerability in its Far East, the continuation of the great game for strategic influence in Central Asia, as well as unfulfilled Russian expectations of greater Chinese financial support during the last 3 years of Western financial sanctions against Moscow. Would normalization and accommodation with the Trump administration afford President Putin a new political and strategic freedom of maneuver in his dealings with Beijing? I don't know. But we should bear in mind that many Russians have concluded that the China-Russia relationship is no longer a relationship of equals. And second, if President Putin's Russia did seek to move in the direction of greater strategic distancing from Beijing, what countermeasures will the Chinese seek to adopt to arrest any such strategic realignment between Moscow and Washington? Or third, is it more likely that President Putin, known for his agile diplomacy, will seek to locate Russia instead in a strategic swing position, equidistant from both Beijing and Washington? These would constitute what Donald Rumsfeld might once have said as being a number of known unknowns in the future construction of this triangular relationship between Washington, Beijing and Moscow. But my simple submission to you today is that this most fundamental part of the post-72 strategic order is no longer fixed, it is fluid, and we do not know where it will land. Challenge number 5, the future of the global trade and economic order. President Trump, as we have already noted, is both a nationalist and a protectionist, and he sees nothing wrong with either. President Trump's explicit protectionism, however, represents again an historic departure from the policies of successive US administrations since the conclusion of the GATT in 1944. If we accept the logic that post-war global trade has been a major contributor to increased global economic growth, poverty reduction, and radically improved individual living standards for many, if not all, in the world, then the return to protectionism must command the attention of all of us in the international community. President Trump's threats of a trade and currency war with China, if executed, would have profound economic consequences for the global economy. It would result in lost growth and lower trade and investment flows between these two economies, one the largest, the other the second largest in the world, and between them and the rest of the world. We're also familiar with President Trump's position on both the TPP and NAFTA. The core challenge is that given President Trump's predilection for nationalism, protectionism, and what I would call a new bilateralism based on the art of the deal, the future of the post-war trading order currently anchored in the WTO could well be thrown up into the air. Put bluntly, if unilateral action is taken by the United States against a state party to the World Trade Organization, and the WTO's dispute resolution mechanisms are simply ignored by an incoming US administration, then it would not take long for the entire global trading system to unravel. Similarly, on the possibility of currency wars, we must be mindful of the fragile consensus that underpins the International Monetary Fund on currency stability and the financial regulatory reform agenda currently entrusted to the Financial Stability Board under the G20. In summary, we need to be mindful of what would happen with the rapid unravelling of long-established institutional arrangements currently underpinning international trade, investment, capital flows, and currency management. In my own darkest moments, I'm concerned about the re-emergence of a Smoot-Hawley tariff by stealth, or in slow motion, and by different means over the years ahead. And for those of us with a mind for economic history, Smoot-Hawley did not end entirely well, either for the United States or for the rest of the world in the dark decade that became the 1930s. Other big challenges, and I conclude with these. To briefly outline in a single sentence a further 5 additional big politics, big challenges for the year ahead. First, the future of the European Union and NATO, given the current dynamics with Brexit, upcoming elections in France and Germany, and a geopolitical realignment perhaps between Washington and Moscow. Although I, for one, believe it to be foolish to reach the faddish conclusion that the EU is now in irreversible decline. That is simply unempirical. If Fillon and Merkel, for example, win the next French and German elections, France and Germany between them have sufficient critical mass between them to defend, advance, and to reinvent the European project. There's nothing determinist about this. Second, what will the Trump administration mean for the rest of Asia, particularly the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Indonesia, given Mr. Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric, where it has been badly received, and India, including the future trajectory of the India-Pakistan relationship? Third, what's the possibility of a third intifada within Israel, accompanied by the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, in the aftermath of any decision by a Trump administration to formally move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, as well as the formal dissolution of the two-state solution? Fourth, what is the future of the overall global geopolitical order anchored in the UN, including the authority of the Security Council, given President Trump's emerging hostility to the UN itself? And 5, and finally, the continued unravelling of the now centuries-old Western democratic project for multiple reasons, including the collapse of the political centre in some countries, the rapid rise of the far left and the far right in some countries, in response to the pressures of neoliberal globalisation, and whether this leads in turn to a more comprehensive repudiation of the dynamics of globalisation which have been driving the global economy for the last quarter of a century or more. Or will we instead see a readjustment to the globalisation project to place human dignity and social solidarity more at the centre? Again, there's nothing determinist about that as well. To conclude, each of these 10 challenges that I've listed naturally gives rise to the question, what then should be done? As I've said repeatedly this evening, there's nothing inevitable about any of these resulting in catastrophe. There is the question of political agency, human agency, and foreign policy agency. That's why we're in the business, to make a difference. But these are questions, policy questions, for countries great and small, all countries great and small. And it's also a question for India and my good friends here. Will India seek to focus primarily, or even exclusively, on what the Trump administration means narrowly for the future of the Washington, Beijing, New Delhi, Islamabad set of relationships? Or, given the larger set of forces for change now unleashed in East Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region, will India choose to take on a broader set of foreign and security policy responsibilities, perhaps consistent with some of the remarks we heard from Prime Minister Modi this evening? And as for the challenges to the global order itself, on peace and security, on international law, on trade and development, and on climate change, will India now take on bigger responsibilities again to protect and advance a global rules-based system? Of course, these are questions for India alone, and it's not my place to suggest at all what India should do. But my simple message this evening here in Delhi, a city I've come to genuinely enjoy over the years, is that in this year of living dangerously, 2017, where we have so many mega challenges, which are so great in magnitude, so complex in their dimensions, and unfolding simultaneously, the demand of international political and policy leadership is now greater than any time since the end of the Cold War. But I'm confident, quietly confident, that given the global vision outlined just now by Prime Minister Modi in this forum, India will indeed rise to the challenge. I thank you for your attention.
Friends on the panel, ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister Rudd wanted an invitation, and I've been thinking about cricket and multilateralism, and we'd be very happy to invite you back when Australia comes. But then, as I've been instructed to do, is to think twice before speaking. And my second thoughts were, we'll defeat you, and that wouldn't be such a good idea. The subject today, my friends, is multipolarity and multilateralism. These are familiar tropes of the diplomatic dialectic. And yet, when we live in turbulent times, as we do today, I'm often reminded that perhaps the prevailing image by which we should see international affairs is a kaleidoscope. All the pieces remain the same, and yet one small shift changes the pattern. One little statement, one little event, or one big event changes the pattern. And again, we are reminded over and over again that the challenge of diplomacy is how to find out the relationship between text and context. The text, the words itself that we are using, perhaps it might help to begin with a literal understanding of multipolarity and multilateralism, polarity and lateralism. Polarity is a vertical. It's a pole. In terms of the big power status of multiple poles across the world, no big power has actually ever been alone. Big power is surrounded by a cluster. even at the height of the Cold War, it was not a bipolar world. The American side had the geopolitical and economic strength of Europe, of many parts of the world behind it. The Soviet Union had the Warsaw Pact and the support of many nations behind it. It did occur to me that during that great confrontation, that one of the most interesting aspect of it was that the non-aligned movement, NAM, was actually a multilateral alternative to a multipolar problem. Multilateralism, on the other hand, is actually a side-to-side equation built of a collection of states. And that is why the United Nations is the ultimate, as we heard just now, is the ultimate institution of multilateralism. The issue to my mind at the moment is that all our constructs of how to sort these problems that we face are built around our understanding of the nation state, whether it is the term big power, whether it is the term multipolarity, or whether it is multilateralism. All of these are specific variations with the nation state at the center of it. And has the commitment to seeing the world through the nation state. The nation state itself, in historical terms, is a comparatively recent phenomenon. It begins truly, whatever its origins might be in Europe, the nation state as we understand it begins with the collapse of the age of empire. And the age of empire began to collapse actually in Latin America first, but in our country by 1857 and 1918 at the end of the First World War. In historical terms, not very long period, 50, 60 years. We have seen the collapse of all the traditional empires, whether it was the Chinese, the Indian, the Tsarist, the Ottoman, I mean, you can name it everywhere. And by the end of the Second World War, the colonial powers also collapsed. And we filled this vacuum with nation states. And nation states have therefore been the basis on which we seek to understand. But has this fact actually blindsided us to the most visceral challenge of our times, which the Prime Minister has at another point described as the existential challenge? Because the big powers that have risen, which we've seen, a new big power has risen, and this is the power of terrorism. But the power of terrorism lives outside the space of nation states. It actually has recreated itself as a presence which not only lives outside the nation states, but one of the greatest dangers of terrorism is that it challenges the nation state itself as a basis of political mobilization. And therefore, you have the emergence of concepts, dead concepts, like the caliphate. At one level, the caliphate is nothing but a resurrection of the romance of regression for reasons which have their own complex origins. Basically, the return in the parts of the Muslim world of a sense of despair. Literally, if you see the turbulence in the Muslim world, you will see that most of the turbulence in the Muslim world is in the space that has been vacated by the Ottoman and the Mughal empires. But this creation of an alternative idea to the nation state is something that leaves us puzzled and actually befuddled. Look at the two great wars that most of us here, I mean almost all of us here, now remember. One has been referred to because President Karzai is with us. But the two long wars that we have seen in our lifetime have been the Vietnam War and the Afghan War. The Vietnam War was a war for nationalism. one side won, the other side lost. In the historical terms, that is less important than the fact that the war began and the war ended when it did end. What is the Afghan war all about? That is a question that we need to think about. Is this a war for nationalism? Is this a war when one side is looking simply to reconstruct Afghanistan by the terms of reference that it imagines is the best for the country? And the answer is no. The Taliban does not represent merely a national force of Afghanistan. It may have elements of nationalism, but its primary motive is not nationalism. Its primary motive is the creation of what it describes as Islamic space. Now, I don't contribute to the description because I think the word Islamic is being misused. One of the great problems of current discourse is that Islam is being blamed for the sins of Muslims. But they are being driven by the creation. And therefore, if they do capture Kabul, as they did, the war doesn't end. Because Kabul is not the primary objective or the destination. It becomes the launching pad and a sanctuary for another war. For a war against United States, a war against Russia, a war against India, or a war against anyone that they consider. Just because the terrorists are in clusters which are diffused, we should not be so naive as to imagine that they do not have a strategic objective. We should not imagine that they are without the process by which they want to actually achieve something. They do want to achieve it. What is the primary instrument that they use? The primary instrument is not simply a bomb or a bullet. The bomb or a bullet actually serves a very different cause. Their primary objective is the spread of fear and to destabilize perfectly harmonious societies which have taken a long time to create harmony in their systems, to destabilize them. Far more powerful than the bombs and bullets that they use, therefore, is the image of Jihadi John. That single image probably had more impact across the world than any other. And it served their objective of creating fear. The destabilization of fear is something that we are now beginning to see in the political processes of democratic nations. We are seeing how this is influencing election results and thereby changing as I said, the patterns that exist in the kaleidoscope. The other side of the fear coin is that the terrorists themselves do not fear fear. You can't frighten to death somebody who's willing to die. You can't frighten to death somebody who sleeps in a suicide vest. The problem is that nations who have lived through conventional challenges, nations and their elites and their governing elites who have lived through convention are still unable to grapple with a problem that they cannot fully understand. And such is the lack of understanding that over 20 years, the United Nations has not been able to find a definition for terrorism, has not been able to find a definition for something that actually seeks to destroy the architecture of international stability. It isn't as if, in historical terms, we haven't been here before. Those with some knowledge of the history of the Middle East will recall Hassan Sabah and the Old Man of the Mountains and Alamut. He too lived outside the conventional spaces of kingdoms and empires and wreaked havoc at his time. I would like to leave this, our very august and distinguished audience, with simply 3 questions. And I can say something before I read the question. I'm very, very happy that I'm not required to answer them. 1, how much can any leader who emerges out of any process, how much actually can any leader reposition the national interest? This is something, an answer we will be finding out. We'll be finding out the answer to this question. Has multilateralism, the new good, squeezed nationalism into impotence? And if it has done so, what are the consequences of that impotence? How weak has nationalism become? These questions are actually getting resonance in votes across the world. At this time of great conflict, what does the world do about Vichy governments? Vichy governments, I'm sure I don't have to explain to you, in the Second World War, part of France was controlled by Vichy, who was not with de Gaulle and officially not with the Nazis. But the Vichy government was a fraud, essentially. It was duplicity, it was hypocrisy. So how does the world deal with nations which have become basically hypocrites in this conflict? And finally, for the more sober among you, how do you get a legal framework to fight a war against barbarians? This is again one of the major challenges. We don't know. We are not even trying to find out. And if we don't find out, the consequences of complacence will be, alas, too heavy to bear. I just want to conclude with one thought. History begins again each time anyone writes a book that history is dead. Thank you very much, and I hope this is the beginning of a very stimulating conference.